You're listening to Voces, Críticas, Critical Voices. I am your producer and host, Silvana Falcón. Today I'm here with Nina Simon, director of the Santa Cruz Museum of Art and History. Nina has led the MA since 2011 with an emphasis on building community through participatory events, exhibitions, and projects. Nina is an internationally recognized expert on active community participation in cultural institutions and has been named a quote-unquote museum visionary by Smithsonian Magazine for her innovative approaches to design. Nina was a Santa Cruz Woman of the Year in 2017 and a Silicon Valley 40 Under 40 award recipient. Nina is the author of The Participatory Museum, published in 2010, The Art of Relevance, published in 2016, and the popular blog Museum 2.0. Nina holds a BS from Worcester Polytechnic Institute in Electrical Engineering and Mathematics. She loves waking up in the redwoods every day. Thank you so much, Nina, for joining us.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
So tell me when and how you joined the MA. You joined in 2011, and this is a time of a bit of financial peril for the MA. And you wrote on your Museum 2.0 blog, you wrote, quote, "When I started as executive director, I was 29 years old. I knew nothing about management, nothing about fundraising, but the museum needed a new direction, and the board took a risk on me." Why do you think the board chose you, given the financial situation the museum was dealing with at the time?
Someone once told me a crisis is a terrible thing to waste, and I really believe that sometimes it's in those times of crisis that we can have the most generative creativity and the most openness to new directions. And I think that for the MA and for the board of the MA in 2011, there really was this sense that coming out of the financial crisis of 2008, struggling with some issues around keeping the museum open, making the museum relevant to our diverse community, there was a strong sense that our backs were against the wall, we were close to closing the museum, and so it was time to try something new. And I remember when I was being interviewed for the job, I said, I'm not the right person for this job all the time, but I think I might be the right person right now because I'm ready to take the risks and have a vision for where this could go and really have a vision of how to manifest this thing that you've said you care about. At the time, the board said, we're looking for somebody who can make this a thriving central gathering place for our community, and we don't really know what that looks like. And so I may not have known how to run a nonprofit, but I did have a sense about how to make a space like the MA a thriving central gathering place.
I think this speaks on some level to the benefit that the board took the risk, because I'm thinking if you're in an institution that's in financial peril, you're probably looking for a fundraiser, like a mega fundraiser, right? Somebody who has all of this kind of experience with that. But that doesn't necessarily get to the strengths and talents that you were bringing at that time in terms of trying to really revitalize this place. For you, as somebody who is looking at this job, what about it appealed to you to even apply?
My background in museums had been as an exhibit designer. I was at the Spy Museum in Washington, D.C., and at Science and Children's Museums before that. And in 2007, my husband and I packed up our car, left Washington, and moved here to Santa Cruz to the mountains. And so we were already here in the area, and I had been working as a consultant with museums around the world, working with them on exhibits, but also programmatic projects that were all about community participation. So working with teenagers in Roxbury and Boston to co-create exhibits about science in the YMCAs, working with youth in Columbus, Ohio to co-create programs in their museum, doing lots of different projects like that. And for me, first of all, having moved to Santa Cruz, such an extraordinary place, but to spend all my work time on the road or working remote, I didn't feel like I was really getting involved in this community. And then also my work increasingly became focused on this idea of deep community participation. And at some point, it became kind of ridiculous to imagine that I could go, whether it was to Boston or to Taipei or the Netherlands or all over the world where I worked as a consultant. I didn't know those communities deeply. All I could do was be a trainer and a support to organizations, which I loved doing. But I knew that for myself to grow creatively and to go to the next level, I wanted to really dive into what it was like to directly work with and really to work for a community that I was so passionate about being part of. So for me, the MA job coming open in this time of crisis, which also meant a time of possibility, was a really perfect match for my desire to go deeper with community participation and to get more deeply involved in this chosen community of Santa Cruz County.
You took a risk too.
Oh, and I had a killer consulting career, as my husband would tell you at the time, I had a half-time job playing beach volleyball. I mean, my life was pretty good on some level, but I really felt that there was a huge opportunity at the mall and a huge opportunity in Santa Cruz County, that we have such a creative community, such a culturally curious community. And, there was a sense that the mall could do and could be more. And I knew that it wasn't just about the institution doing more. It was about how could we open our doors and be a platform for all this incredible creative and cultural energy of Santa Cruz County. It was just such a clear, exciting opportunity.
Well, it looks like the universe had a plan for you. So I'm thinking here, you walk in day one, week one. Where did you start? Where do you begin with the rebuilding that you did?
There are two parts to that. One was financial. When I came in, we only had a week of cash in the bank and we had some debt. And so, unfortunately, some of the less fun stuff that I did right away was we all took 20% salary cuts, including me. And we had some people on furlough in different ways. Everybody's afraid for their jobs. I said, you know what? We're going to cut to the bone so that A, we're all in it together, and B, as we start to raise money, we're going to raise money for the new direction instead of putting it into a hole of things that may not be serving us. And so that was the painful but important part. But the other part was right from the beginning, starting to show ourselves and the community how we wanted to shift what this institution was all about. So actually, one of the very first things I did my first week, in addition to doing some of the most painful management stuff I've ever had to do, was paint the comment wall that's in the lobby of the mall. And to just start to, in physical ways, in symbolic ways, to say to our community, we want your ideas, we want your suggestions, we want your opinions, bring it on. And we tried to do that in so many different ways. Then what we started to do was to say, what are the biggest barriers to those people who we think are just a step or two away from coming into a place like the Ma? How can we break down some of those barriers? So in my first year, we really focused on two things. One was making the building feel more welcoming, because a lot of people said, oh, it feels like a jail here, remembering the history. And then also to start to have an event-forward approach, where we said, you know what, exhibitions are incredibly important, but they take a long time and they're expensive. The single fastest way we can show somebody that the museum is for them is to fill the museum with people who they might want to connect with. And so we started really looking to create festivals and bike-based history scavenger hunts and artist sleepovers. And we experimented with so many different kinds of events to start to try on different ways of being. It's interesting on that end. While I think that on the welcoming side, we've continued to work to make the building, the programming, the experience more welcoming. On the event side, I really thought that that would be a short-term strategy and that we would be event-driven for a while to kind of get people to get connected with it and then shift to a more exhibition-driven strategy. But I think what we learned, especially in a place like downtown Santa Cruz, is that, this is not the kind of town where people are waking up on Sunday morning and saying, oh, what should we do today? Oh, let's go to the museum. No, it's the farmer's market, it's surfing, it's mountain biking. But people are saying, what should we do on Thursday evening? Where could we go that isn't just the movies, the Catalyst, or a bar full of undergrads? And not that I have anything against any of those things.
No offense.
But we saw that there were other cultural gaps in our offerings. So we realized that having an event-driven strategy actually was not just a means to an end, but became really central to how the MA could serve our community. And that's continued to this day.
I mean, the location of the MA is fantastic. And
unbelievable.
So it just seemed like perfect if you just get the ideas and the people there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I, from day one, knew that while I wasn't clear on what was going on in the building, I was clear about what a great building it was, what a great location it is, and the fact that the MA manages Abbott Square meant that there was real opportunity for us to grow into more space, which obviously we've now done.
And so you're saying when you first started, people have to take a salary cut. There's some really painful kind of decisions you have to make as the director. How big is the team at this point in the rebuilding effort?
At the time, it was 7 when I started. We're at about 40 now. Actually, I went across the street to Trader Joe's and I got 2 really cheap bottles of, they're definitely not champagne. I don't know what it is. And I labeled one of them $50,000 and one of them $100,000. And I said, okay, when we get $50,000 in the bank, we're going to open this one and we're going to go to 10% salary cuts instead of 20. And when we get to $100,000 in the bank, we're going to open this one and everybody's going to get paid as they should. And it was funny, actually, when we opened that first bottle, we made this 2-minute video. There are all these crazy things you do when you're new and you're just trying to make things happen. So we made this video just sort of saying thank you to donors who'd helped us get there. And people loved it. And it actually really accelerated our ability to bring in dollars in a very different way, probably, than a traditional fundraiser would, but in a very Santa Cruz way, to be transparent, to be creative, to be fun. And I just always believed that if we were going to change the institution, we couldn't expect people to take it on faith that we were going to do what we were talking about. We had to start showing it. And so even when you think about making the building more welcoming, I remember we had interns who would troll Craigslist and would get free couches off of the street. And then donors would come in, they'd say, "Where'd you get those couches? They look like they came off the side of the road." And I'd say, "Yes, they did. Would you like to buy us a new couch?" And you know what? We got new couches eventually, but we would not have gotten the new couches if we hadn't started by showing in all of these spit and duct tape ways, hey, this could be something different. We could welcome people in a new way. We could create something that really speaks to the identity and what we're proud of here in Santa Cruz County.
I mean, that is what's so interesting about where you were in 2011 and where you are now, is that the ability to just try, right?
Yeah.
That opportunity is now available to you because what do you have to lose?
Right.
And I think there's something very freeing about that.
Yeah. And we try and really hold that spirit still, but have more support under it. And that means that we can really operationalize how do artists work? How do we support people with their wild ideas and be a safe space for that? But it is challenging. It's very different to be a staff of 7 with nothing to lose than to be a staff of 40 with a $3 million budget and with 150,000 people participating and really passionate about and depending on the experiences they're having with us. It's interesting how over the years, I think the approach we've tried to take is to say, how can we shift from wide open yes, which may be exhausting for us and may be frustrating or confusing for our collaborators or visitors, to starting to create different kinds of designed containers for yes. So whether that's, oh, we have this program series, so, oh, you do this, great, let's put you in here. Or whether it's saying, okay, we have an exhibition strategy now of saying, here are the kinds of exhibits we do when. So we're not trying to switch from yes to no or from yes to bureaucracy, but to try and say, how can we create a structure for yes so that our staff know what they're doing, so that our collaborators have a place to fit in, and so visitors can understand what the heck's going on?
Well, and then it allows you to have a strategy in terms of not everything has to be yes now, right?
Which I'm pretty bad at. I love yes now. I've had to learn more about that. Yes.
That at least allows the energy to sort of stay up, because then you're not exhausting all the staff.
There's this story about the head of the NEA. This is a few years ago, and the head of the Department of Homeland Security were in a car going somewhere together. This is not a joke. This is real. And the head of the NEA, Jane Chu, got these urgent calls, and the head of the Department of Homeland Security was like, oh, is there an art emergency? But look, we live in urgent times. And I actually think as a leader, one of the most important things you can do is calibrate urgency and energy, right? And to figure out, when is urgency knocking on your door from outside, as it was for us when we were in crisis? And how do we now, as we grow and as we're more stable, how do we cultivate urgency without getting into mania? And how do we keep ourselves energetic and keep ourselves open and not get complacent or so proud of, oh, we got this all figured out or anything? But how can we do that from a position knowing that we are, supportive of ourselves and each other and taking care of ourselves along the way?
So one of the funnest things I learned about your biography is that you have a Bachelor of Science degree in electrical engineering and mathematics. Yeah. And there's this really dominant view, which I'm sure you've heard about as well, that, your bachelor's degree has to completely determine the entire trajectory of your career and your life in this sort of very narrowly defined kind of way. So what would you say, even thinking back in your own life, what it meant to think about your bachelor's degree and the trajectory and the wild ride, quite frankly, that you've been on?
I don't subscribe to that theory. And I think that one of the things I love about free choice learning environments, whether that be museums, libraries, parks, is that they're spaces that, at least in theory, are open to everyone to participate from many different levels and many different backgrounds and experiences. And so I feel pride to work in a universe where people can bring different experience to the table and it can be valued, and we don't have to all come from a narrow educational background. Now, look, I also know that I am lucky and privileged to be where I am, and that for a lot of people, and particularly in museums, there are so many entry-level jobs that require graduate degrees, which is nuts. And so I think that I personally have been somebody who always has believed in learning from many different lateral sources. I also feel, just as a lot of people feel, that a liberal arts education is valuable and powerful for life, as I believe it surely is. For me, having an engineering degree is very valuable and powerful for my life, as it is, my friends who have art degrees. So I think about it in terms of my brain has been trained in a way that is useful for the kinds of experimentation, problem solving, iterative, hypothesis-based work that I love to do. But I don't feel limited that it had to be in math or science or engineering.
Right, and probably the engineering degree is partly why you're so passionate about design.
Yeah,
right?
Absolutely. And particularly the design process and just taking an attitude of what's our hypothesis? What can we experiment with? What did we learn from that? How are we going to iterate? And this idea that especially something like a museum or a cultural institution, it's alive and iterative. It's not fixed and singular. And it's ironic, right? Because I think a lot of people with engineer brains are seen as being very narrow. But to me, engineering can be a very creative, experimental practice.
Partly I ask this question because I deal with students almost on a daily basis who have a lot of anxiety about their major, as if somehow, if they don't identify the perfect major, the rest of their life has been predetermined. And so I appreciate you sort of sharing that actually, really, the sky's the limit. You can go on a completely different trajectory if that's where life takes you.
I mean, certainly at the MA, we've put a big emphasis on, as we do hiring, because we've hired a lot of people in the years I've been there and before and will do in the future, really making sure we're creating job descriptions such that they are inclusive in terms of saying who's able to do this job. And that, what is that demonstrated by? And I can tell you it is almost never demonstrated by what degree you have, and not just what your major is, but even whether it's a bachelor's or grad degree or whatever. My personal perspective is if you want to do a certain job, you just need to show those people that you can do that job well. And I think about, you were asking at the top about my starting at the MA, and I knew when I applied that I had these real deficiencies in my resume, right? I knew that I had a 2 in the front of my age. And so part of my strategy was that when I was applying, I decided, what are the questions they're going to have about me where they're going to be saying, well, but can she X? And how could I proactively address those? So, when I was applying to work at the MA, I wrote a 3-year plan, unbidden, just to show them I could do that strategy work. Or, years prior, when I first got my very first museum job at the Spy Museum, they were looking for somebody with a graduate degree in museum studies. This was for a programs and exhibit support role. And I came to the second interview and I said, well, I don't have this portfolio you're asking for. I don't have a graduate degree, but I can do this. And I had a little paper bag, like a lunch bag. And I had made a little lie detector at home. And this was at the International Spy Museum. And I said, hey, I could teach workshops for teens, for adults, for whoever on how to do things with electronics. And my guess is that your people with their museum studies graduate portfolios may not be able to bring this to the table. And, and then they have to decide if they want that thing or not. But I feel like, especially if you have a non-traditional background, show them that they would be fools to pass up the opportunity to work with you. I went to this training for organizers, actually, and for people trying to lead large-scale social change. And they talked about the idea that everybody has these different zones that you work in. You have your zone of incompetence. Those are the things you're not good at. You have your zone of competence, things you can do, reasonably well. You have your zone of excellence, things you do very well. And then you have your zone of genius. And it was really interesting that the point they made was, for high-performing people, the most likely trap you fall into is spending all your time in your zones of excellence and competence because you're good at those things, you like checking things off the list, you know how to do them well, and robbing yourself of time in your zone of genius. And it's something I've been thinking about a lot as I've been thinking about, where I want to take my own work and thinking about, yes, I take pleasure in things I'm competent at and excellent at, but how could I challenge myself to spend more time really working with those strengths and talents that I feel could be my greatest contribution?
Okay, I'm going to start thinking about my own zone of genius.
Yeah, good, yeah.
You were listening to Nina Simon, director of the Santa Cruz Museum of Art and History. So Nina, let's talk about some of your published work. And I was looking at your book, The Participatory Museum, which to me really read like a how-to guide for not only participatory museums, but I really thought about it as a participatory democracy. When did you start to become interested in conceptualizing museums as this cultural community space for participation?
So, it's the mid-2000s. I was living in Washington, D.C., and was working in a museum as an exhibit designer, but living in a group house full of a mixture of activists and techies in startup land. And at the time, I was incredibly shy, new to museums, and I went to one of the huge national museum conferences. And I remember people who you're like, ooh, you're amazing. I'm just going to go to your talks. And I started to kind of identify who those people were. And those people tended to be in their 50s at the time, and they were asking questions in the mid-2000s about what is Wikipedia going to do to museums? What is the YouTube of museums? And I heard those questions and I thought, these people are brilliant, and I don't know that they're in the generational moment to be able to answer those questions. And so I, in my nerdy way, was like, okay, maybe the way I could talk to these brilliant people is if I go home and start doing some research on my own and start a blog. I loved writing, and start to explore these topics. And then I could email them and say, oh, that question you asked at that conference? I have been thinking about this. It actually sort of worked out that way, which is kind of shocking. But anyway, because I was both in the museum world, but also socially and just as a young 20-something in a tech environment that was all about Web 2.0, I really became curious, not so much how museums and cultural institutions could use the technology, but more how could the principles behind something like, the open world of Wikipedia or the participatory world of YouTube or any of these things, how could those kinds of theories and approaches apply in cultural and civic life? And so I've always been somebody who is interested in cultural participation as a populist. While I was a university student in engineering, I was also a slam poet, but it wasn't until kind of those two things came together of museum life and then Web 2.0 world, and really starting to do my own personal research around that on the Museum 2.0 blog, that I started diving into those ideas.
So you were an electrical engineer slam poet.
Yeah.
Is that what you're telling me, Nina?
That's correct.
Oh my goodness. You are really multifaceted.
And a boxer. Yeah.
and a boxer. I think that's why when I was looking at the book, I really thought about it as participatory democracy, because when you create these spaces that bring people together, you are ultimately asking for an engaged participant, engaged attendee. And so that's why for me, there was this real clear link in that book between the museum as being this space of democracy and very much you're, democratizing the space. And I think when we talk about how you started the museum and opening it up and getting for comments, to me, that's the democratic process at work.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you know, there are a lot of stories in that book from libraries, from parks, from zoos, from businesses, and I'm pretty sector as agnostic in terms of where the good ideas are. And I think you're right that a museum, a library, a park can all function in this way. And I think it's become even more acute that there are fewer and fewer public or civic spaces that really different people can come to. And so for those spaces to be closed, to be elitist, to be disengaging, to be authoritarian, really diminishes our ability to participate in a democracy and in democratic life. But when those spaces are open, are welcoming, are participatory, are engaging, it unlocks that democratic potential.
You always think about how fundamental design is to participation. A bad design will lead to bad participation. And so if the design is not thoughtful, if the design is not intentional, the participation really reflects that. It's not so much about the people. It's the design has not been thoughtfully conceptualized in order to enable for sort of thoughtful participation. At what point do you make that discovery about you don't fault the people? You think about where did I go wrong here in the vision?
That's a really well put question. And I think, to be honest, and this is kind of embarrassing, for me it comes back to being that shy person who really didn't necessarily understand how to, for example, approach strangers and have a conversation at a conference or at a cocktail party or something like that. I didn't have that in me. And so as an engineer, I was interested in how can I design, or where are there design spaces that make that easier, that make that more authentic, that make that more real. And just as you can have a cocktail party conversation that is totally superficial or very deep, the design of space, the design of the experience, it's not just about who the people are, it's about how we're invited to show up in those spaces. And so I think that because it was not obvious to me how to have that social experience, I started looking for ways to intentionally iterate and test and design that in. And while we started out talking about democracy here, for me, fundamentally, a lot of my design work was driven by a desire to bring strangers together and around this idea of social bridging, and that it's so hard for us to make meaningful connections with people who are really different from us, from different walks of life or different backgrounds. And so a lot of the design work that I've done or that I am passionate about, yes, it's participatory, but it's often participatory towards an end of dialogue and of connection.
You're listening to Nina Simon, director of the Santa Cruz Museum of Art and History. In your TED Talk, Santa Cruz, you start off your talk by saying, I'm an activist about this stuff. Mm-hmm. What does an activist mean to you?
Activists and artists start with a very similar root, which is a sense of a vision for a way that things could be different. But then I think that they then deviate in that activists then are focused on how can I make that real, and artists are focused on how can I visualize that and how can I communicate it. And so I guess that for me, it also means just not being satisfied with the status quo of what, for example, a museum is or should be, and being ready to boldly and confidently speak out for changes that not everybody might like, but that I believe are going to make these institutions more welcoming and inclusive.
You made 3 really key points in that TED Talk. One being opening up to participatory culture. The second point you made was artifacts as social objects. And the third point you said was about making museums that matter. And we've talked a little bit about point 1, but I really want to talk about points 2 and 3. Explain what you mean when you talk about viewing artifacts as social objects.
Earlier, I was, talking about this idea of using design to connect people to each other. And I think that objects can really do that. And one of the beautiful things about a museum is that it's organized around objects, and that those objects can kind of become third things, so that instead of you and I having to talk directly about an issue, we can talk about an object that might speak to that issue. One example, we're working on right now an exhibition in partnership with seniors struggling and working through social isolation. When we started to think about what objects will be in this show, and we asked seniors, what does isolation look like in terms of objects? And people would say things like, it's my address book with all of my favorite people, their addresses are crossed out because they've died. It's the leash to the dog I can't have anymore. It's the keys to the car I can't drive anymore. It's the phone that doesn't ring and my kids not calling as often as I'd like. And you can really imagine how, as we're building that exhibit now, I really believe that those simple objects, those address books, those leashes, those phones, are going to spark conversations about how we want to grow old, how we want to take care of ourselves and each other, that we may not feel comfortable having otherwise. And so I really feel like objects can open up those opportunities, and that's why I think of them in some circumstances as social.
And thinking about something like loneliness and isolation, these are very, very difficult emotional topics to talk about. And so sometimes we don't have the words.
Right, absolutely.
But we have the objects to describe what we're feeling.
Well, and talk about, museums that matter, right? I think that for us, it's about how can we use objects to illuminate stories that aren't typically being told, and to spark conversation around these issues that might be hard for us to find the words to talk about.
In that TED Talk, you talked about needing to have difficult conversations. From your vantage point, as someone who's trying to facilitate some of these community conversations, what other conversations do you think we should be having as a community, and how can artifacts facilitate some of those more difficult dialogues?
Yeah. So the seniors project I was talking about, which is called We're Still Here and will open in the spring, is actually one in a series that started with this exhibition we did a couple of years ago in partnership with transition age foster youth called Lost Childhoods, where we've decided every other year to co-create an exhibition with community members on an issue that matters in Santa Cruz County. And so we do lots of projects and lots of exhibitions that are tied to local issues. We did a great project with hospice. We're doing a project about the border right now. But I think that this community issue model, and the fact that not only is it about visitors having dialogue around objects, but that the objects themselves are sourced and co-created by community members, is powerful. We have a long list of topics we'd love to do. We're planning to do one of these big projects every other year. The most obvious one that we always say, it's not a question of if, it's a question of when, is about homelessness and housing and gentrification. And, it's interesting that when we think about the when on those, part of it's about urgency. For example, you think about an issue like water. There have been times in Santa Cruz where that has been a very big conversation, and then there are times where it's raining and we're not thinking about it. And so part of it's about what is a timely conversation to have. And then we're also always looking for what is our door or our entry point into an issue that's very divisive, that opens up a different way to talk about it. And so, for example, with seniors in social isolation, we're not going direct from a perspective of, here are the stats, here's exactly what's going on. It's really about inviting people to think about, how do you want to grow old, and how do you want to imagine that part of your life and your life in this community? And so I think particularly with homelessness and housing, we've really been over the years kind of gestating on what could that entry point be around an issue that people are going to walk in with their backs up already about what they think and what they know and how they feel, and how could we start to break that open a little bit? We're starting to figure that out, but I think that for us, that's often the question. There are many issues. It's about where are there issues, where art, where objects, where we have a different way in to open a different kind of conversation.
Well, Nina, there's going to be some big conversations. We're going to have that one at the mall.
And there are urgent issues locally, but also across the state. And one of the things we're really excited about is the foster youth project we did was here, and then we traveled it to Salinas. This seniors in social isolation exhibition we'll do here, and then we're going to travel to at least 3 other Bay Area counties. We've been talking already with some county leaders in other parts of the state about what would it look like to do a homelessness exhibition project that started here and then went to all the counties in California. And what would it be like to have this conversation in locally specific ways, but in object-mediated ways, in all different kinds of museums, art centers, libraries around the state?
You are the outgoing director of the MA, and I was reading on your blog, the Museum 2.0, about this departure. And I just want to read to the listener so they understand kind of how thoughtfully you have thought about this. And you wrote that this has sent me into an honest assessment of my own skills and passions and where I could do my best work. I'm an entrepreneurial, experimental, opportunistic leader. Those skills made me a great fit to turn around and grow the MA to the amazing place it is today. But I see that these same skills could make me a liability to keep the MA strong and growing. I've learned and grown a lot as a manager and leader as the MA has evolved. But the institution is growing beyond my quote-unquote zone of genius. As a risk-taking space maker, the MA doesn't need someone to break it open and rebuild it. It needs someone to deepen and strengthen it. When I read that, Nina, I just thought to myself, what a thoughtful and self-reflexive post to talk about your decision in this sort of, again, transparent way, which has been how you've been running the place. And at the same time, I think people are really anxious about your leaving. And so change can make people uneasy. Mm-hmm. And because the MA has evolved into what it is now, what would you tell people who are maybe feeling a little bit anxious about the leadership change that's going to be coming?
Well, I felt anxious about it too, and I really do feel like what changed for me was when I started to have that realization that you just read out and just realizing, you know what? I think that the museum is incredibly strong. We have amazing staff. And at this point, if you're coming up and saying thanking to me at an event in the MA, which is my great pleasure that people do all the time, I always accept thank yous. And one of my big things is like, you should never diss a thank you. And 99% of the time, I had almost nothing to do with what is happening at that moment because we have such an incredible team who are so committed to the values that really are rooted in what the MA is, including our board, including our volunteers, just top to bottom. So I really feel that the MA as it is strong, and that the people who will continue to make it strong, A, are here and persisting, and B, are the ones who are leading the search for who that next director will be. So I think that they're holding those values strong in that search. I know that I'm really committed to the MA being successful. You know, my husband and I and family, we're staying in Santa Cruz. I'm staying at the MA for a period to ensure that a new person can get launched. And then I look forward to being a supporter and a cheerleader from the side. And I also just feel, you know, to what you're saying about change and the unknowable, that that's what life is. And I think that we have created something beautiful at the MA, and I think that it's going to keep getting stronger. And I really see, Silvana, that there are opportunities for the MA that I'm not the right person to take on, and I can't wait to see what somebody else does with it.
So let's talk about Of, By, For All. This is the next thing. This is your next passion project, right, which is incubated there at the MA. Tell us what Of, By, For All is.
Of By For All is a set of tools and a community of organizations around the world that are saying we want the work that we do to be of, by, and for our community. We want our leadership, the stories we tell, the things we share to be representative of our community. We want all of our programming to be co-created by our community, and we want to be welcoming for our community. So we're building a network of all kinds of organizations. Yes, museums, but also libraries, parks, theaters. We have a radio station in this first wave, a health center, all different kinds of organizations that are passionate about community involvement. So that's what Of By For All is. And it's incubated at the MA because it originated out of this funny problem we noticed at the MA, which was that as we grew, in addition to all of the growing energy and involvement here locally, we started getting more and more inquiries from around the world, from organizations saying, gosh, I've read your story, or I came and visited, or people just show up every once in a while and they say, I'm from South Korea, I've come to see the MA, and we just realized, wow, people are really curious about some of our approaches to community involvement. Is there a way that we could share these and not just share them as this is the MA way, but be incubating and helping to nurture a growing community of all kinds of practitioners around the world who have different approaches to community involvement. And we really felt like this idea of being of, by, and for the community was a good conceptual container for what we're talking about. And we also feel like so much work around community involvement or diversity, equity, and inclusion and accessibility often gets very nuanced and very jargony very quickly. And so we were looking for a container and a frame for this that could really feel accessible and open to organizations and individuals who might be starting from very different starting points with regard to the depth of their connection to those concepts.
So Of By All is incubated there at the MA, but you're thinking about its sort of global application then at this point.
That's right. And so it's definitely intended to be a global program. And we're in the process of both recruiting a new museum director and developing a thoughtful way to separate Of By For All from the museum. So Of By For All will always have its birthplace at the MA, have been incubated there, but we are quickly realizing that because it's global and the MA is local, because it's very online and tech enabled, and the MA is very human and in person, that these are really feeling like two different nonprofit organizations with two different missions.
So this will be what you're going to be doing now full time.
Yeah. Right now, my time as the museum director includes time on this project, but the goal and the plan is that by late spring, I'll be transitioning out of the museum and 100% into the project, and that the project will eventually become its own organization.
This then can be a model, a philosophy, a concept that can be in all kinds of settings.
Absolutely. It's much stronger if it works in all different kinds of settings, because right now, if I go, to Berlin to talk to international librarians and I tell just the MA story, then people can say, well, that's a museum, we're a library, or you're in California, we're in wherever. And so the more examples and the more it's rooted in very diverse uses around the world, the more strength and the more take-up can happen. So right now, we're piloting with 21 organizations in 5 countries. That includes the MA here in Santa Cruz, but it also includes groups like the Friends of the LA River State Park in LA, which is an all-volunteer organization, very tiny. It includes the Dakota County Public Libraries, which is the libraries for the Twin Cities of Minnesota. So we're talking about 600 staff members, 16 branches. It includes a transgender health center. It includes a hill in Ireland that is a National Trust site, so like a national park. It includes multiple different kinds of organizations very intentionally so that we can be exploring and experimenting with these ideas with organizations of very different sizes and sectors. We counted, and in the 7 years before we started Of By For All, while I was at the MA, we got inquiries from people in 142 countries about how the MA works in a variety of ways. I spend a couple weeks a year traveling. Obviously, I've written a couple of books. So basically, right now, the demand is coming through people who are already connected. And often, it's either through them looking at what the MA's done, or it's people who have been readers of Museum 2.0, that blog, or the books, or have seen me speak, or things like that. That said, when we opened up the application process for this first wave, for these 21 organizations, we had about 90 applicants, and the majority of them were organizations we'd never worked with lead applicants, individuals who I'd never met. So it's clear that there's a network beyond the network I even know. And so if people are interested, there's a website called ofbyforall.org. And right now we're working with this first wave of 21 organizations, but it's going really well. And we're expecting in 2019 to bring on about 100 more organizations in the next waves. So we're still in the prototyping and piloting mode, so we're not ready to just sort of say, anybody, anywhere, sign up now. But we certainly hope to get there. And we do really feel like our goal is to build this network because so many people who are doing this kind of work are doing it alone. You know, they're in a small community, in a small institution. They're wondering, are we weird because we involve our community in this way? And it's really hard sometimes to find your colleagues when you're taking a different approach. And so we want to build that network. And at the same time, we really want to be identifying and celebrating and driving forward practitioners who are really pushing to involve new communities. Because the other thing I see is, you know, there's a lot of discussion out there about especially diversity, equity, and inclusion, which is great. We need discussion. But I'm a very action-oriented person, and I see how the choices and the changes we've made at the MA have made a difference to who we involve. And I want that for others. And I want to work with those who are ready to say, okay, I'm ready to act. I'm ready to make changes to how I hire, to how I market, to how we program, to how we involve people. And these 21 organizations, they're not just hanging out together. We're basically serving up to them like recipes for change and inviting them to go spend time in that neighborhood that you think you're interested in, but you don't know anybody there, and find a way you can volunteer there. Have a meeting with a potential partner, and instead of focusing on a transactional project you can do, really get to know them and what matters to them. Visit your own space from the perspective or with somebody from that community and really hear the barriers that exist for them. Look at your HR policies or how you recruit your board and make a plan to change how you do this. So we're challenging all these organizations to take real action to move to becoming more of, by, and for their communities, and then serving up this community space so that they have support for each other, from each other as they go.
So, Nina, here we are, KZSC, on the hill here at UC Santa Cruz, on the campus of UC Santa Cruz. We're a 50-year station, community, student-run, a lot of passions here at KZSC. People who've had shows on for 30 years. There's a real deep commitment for the success of the station. We have fabulous listeners. What advice would you give to a place like KZSC that is this long-established 50-year station about what it takes to build an of, by, for all community space that's a radio station?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, what a great question. And we do have a public radio station in Marfa, Texas in our first 21, and it's been wonderful learning with them. So some of what I'd say is generic to any organization, which is, and especially with an organization with 50 years, it can become easy for us to forget that not everybody in our community is our audience or are our participants. And so I think that it's worth starting with a really honest look at who are our insiders, who loves us, who's involved, who's calling in, and who's on the air, and what parts of the community do they represent? Who are our outsiders? Who do we never hear from? Who's never listening, turning the dial to us? And which parts of our outsiders are we interested in involving? And the way we've been taking this approach with Of, By, For All is to invite organizations to identify just one specific community and to say, hey, we're really interested in freshmen who are from further than 100 miles from Santa Cruz because they're new to this area and the radio could be a place they plug in. Or we're really interested in longtime residents of Santa Cruz County who might have stories to share. Or whatever that community might be, getting very specific about saying who's an outside group who we're not currently engaging well, who we might want to involve, and how can we not look at it in a transactional way of just like, oh, let's get them as listeners, as donors, as whatevers, but how can we really get to know what they value and what they could bring of value into a place like KZSC. I do think that radio, one of the things I've been learning from our folks at Marfa Public Radio is that there's this super interesting opportunity around what's happening right here, right? The opportunity to be on air rooted in community. I think that it creates both an incredible basis for being of, by, and for the community because all the programming is co-created by community. But sometimes when you have a basis like that, it can also make you maybe a little less aggressive about pursuing other ways to involve the community. So obviously in an institution like this one, There's a real strength about the fact that the people who are hosting shows reflect diversity of the community in terms of who's presenting. I don't know enough about the station to know where are the weak spots around community involvement. Is it around listenership and audience? In which case I'd say focus on the for. Who are you for? Is it in leadership and representation on the board and on the programming staff? Then I'd say focus on who do you want to be in those seats? Is it about who's in the guest seat and who's in the host seat? Focus on focus on who you're partnering with. Each organization at different times may want to focus different places, may have different strengths. I think that there are incredible strengths in community radio, but that doesn't mean there aren't also opportunities to grow.
And I think by that it means then we don't have to do of, by, for, all right now. Right. We can start with the of, we can start with the by, and then we can go later into the all.
Absolutely. And at the MA, I would say, our strategy really started with the by and with the for. How can we involve more partners and how can we make this space feel more welcoming? And it's just in the last few years that we've really turned our attention to the of, to changing how we hire, how we recruit, how we bring on board members, who's on our board and staff. We didn't start there. Other organizations would. And so we're seeing across this network organizations that are taking different approaches. I will say the one approach you can't be successful forever with is just focusing on for. And I think that a lot of organizations have gotten into a trap, maybe community radio less so, where they say, we'll just market it better, or we'll just create more programs. And it's like, if you are not able to engage certain parts of the community, it's probably because people don't see themselves represented there. That's an of problem. Or because they're not being invited to be part of making it. That's a by problem. The problem is probably not that you didn't put enough flyers in their neighborhood.
Well, Nina, I'm sad to say that we are out of time. Thank you so much, Nina, for your time.
Thank you.